The first light of autumn hit the fields and found them wrong. You can feel it before you see it, the silence where the wind should be rustling the stalks, the smell of damp earth that carries something other than rain. The grain is standing, but it is not golden. It is gray at the base, soft as a wound, and when you touch it, the husk comes away in your hand like wet paper. Imagine a village 1,000 years ago. The children cough in the night. The elders gather by the fire and speak in voices that do not carry. The harvest was supposed to save them. Instead, it is rotting from the inside out, and no one can explain why. They will say the gods are angry. They will say the spirits of the ancestors have turned their backs. They will say the land is cursed. And then someone will remember the old story, the one whispered only in times of desperation, the one that holds a secret so strange, so dangerous that to speak it aloud is almost an act of defiance, the secret that averted the cursed harvest. You have been taught that this is ignorance, that the villagers were trapped in superstition, grasping at shadows in the dark. But what if the opposite is true? What if their secret was not a prayer or a ritual, but something far more ancient and far more necessary, something that still beats in your skull right now and is the only reason you survived the night? This is the part most people miss. The official story is simple. A crop fails because of weather, blight, soil depletion. The villagers, lacking scientific explanation, invent a supernatural curse. But here's the strange part. Across dozens of isolated cultures, the same pattern appears at the same time. Not random superstition, but a structured response with specific rituals, specific taboos, and specific outcomes that cannot be explained by chance. The Zuni built check dams and wicking furrows across their river basin, capturing runoff so efficiently that sediment analysis shows a 45% increase in moisture retention. The Ifugao carved 10,000 hectares of rice terraces into the steep Cordillera highlands, reducing soil erosion by an estimated 70% and allowing 3 crops per year on slopes that should have been barren. The Maya planted the 3 sisters, maize, beans, squash, in a polyculture so stable that pollen data from the classic period shows a 30% increase in yield reliability compared to monocropping. And every single one of these cultures framed their agricultural cycle around a sacred narrative, a story about the land being alive, a story about a curse that could befall the careless. But that is too neat. The real answer is stranger. An fMRI study by Oman and his team in 2001 measured the amygdala response of participants shown images of snakes, spiders, and other ancestral threats. The activation was immediate, automatic, and occurred before conscious recognition. The brain was scanning for danger before the mind knew what it was seeing. This is the same machinery that made the villager look at a gray stalk of grain and feel, not analysis, but dread. Here is what nobody noticed. The curse story was not the explanation. It was the trigger. That is the kind of inversion that changes how you see everything. The moment when the old story flips and reveals its true face. Subscribe to keep following these threads because the pattern runs deeper than any single culture or century, and you have only just begun to see the architecture beneath the myth. What did that trigger feel like when it landed for you? Write curse in the comments if the inversion pulled your attention. Think about that for a moment. The belief system that modern science dismissed as primitive may have been a psychological tool, a pattern recognition mechanism that forced the community to coordinate, to share resources, to implement the very agricultural techniques that kept them alive. Without the narrative of the curse, there was no urgency. Without urgency, there was no cooperation. Without cooperation, the harvest failed. The secret was not the ritual. The secret was the binding. Hufford documented cases across 20 cultures where sleep paralysis victims reported identical spectral figures, the hag, the demon, the old woman. Despite having no shared cultural reference, the brain, faced with a biological anomaly, paints a supernatural portrait because the portrait coordinates survival behavior. The nightmare becomes a warning. The warning becomes a ritual. The ritual becomes the difference between survival and starvation. The cursed harvest worked the same way. When the grain began to gray, the natural response of the individual was to hoard. Fear narrows the focus. The hunter-gatherer who sees scarcity grabs what they can and retreats. This is the survival instinct wired into the oldest parts of your brain. But for an agricultural community, hoarding is death. If every family hides their failing stores, no one shares. If no one shares, the entire village starves. The curse story overrode the instinct. It replaced the individual fear with the collective one. The wrath of the gods, the vengeance of the ancestors, the invisible rot that spreads through the land like a plague. The community no longer acted as separate households. They became one body, directed by a shared terror that was more powerful than their private desperation. Burks, Consolo, and Huntington published a meta-analysis in 2021 examining 84 case studies of traditional ecological knowledge. Their finding: communities that retained their ancestral belief systems experienced a 27% lower incidence of food insecurity during climate extremes compared to those that had abandoned those systems. The effect was statistically significant at p less than 0.001, not luck, not coincidence. Something in the structure of the belief itself was protecting them. But we should be careful. That would be too neat. The real machinery is darker. Consider the Maya Milpa system. The three sisters, maize, beans, squash, were not just crops. They were gods. The maize god was decapitated and reborn with the harvest. The beans were his blood. The squash was the vessel of the earth. The entire agricultural cycle was a sacred drama of death and resurrection, performed annually by the village. And when the storm came, when the drought stretched into its second month, when the children coughed and the grain turned gray, the village did not panic. They had a story for this. The maize god had died before. He would die again. The curse was not an anomaly. It was the pattern. And because they knew the pattern, they knew what to do. They performed the rituals. They redistributed the food. They repaired the terraces. They planted the three sisters in the arrangement that had worked for 1,000 years. The curse story did not cause the survival. The curse story enabled the survival. The old answer was simple. We are rational. They were primitive. We have science. They had superstition. But the real answer is probably not that clean, and finding out why is what separates surface knowledge from the hidden truth you came here for. That is the kind of truth that builds a community, not just a viewer count. If this resonance has gripped you, subscribe and become part of something that the old stories called a tribe, because we are excavating the dark machinery together, and the next discovery depends on who stays in the cave. Drop binding in the comments if you feel that shift from individual to collective. The second crack in the official story is even more unsettling. When researchers examined the caloric expenditure of ritual behavior in traditional agricultural societies, they found something unexpected. The rituals were not wasteful. They were efficient. The dances, the offerings, the processions, they mapped onto the precise times of year when the community needed to move, to dig, to burn, to plant. The sacred calendar was a work schedule synchronized by belief. Have you ever wondered why so many harvest festivals coincide with the exact weeks when the grain must be threshed? Not approximately, exactly, to within days, because the festival was the work, the god was the deadline, the curse was the consequence, and the secret, the one the elders whispered when the harvest began to gray, was not a prayer at all. It was a memory, the encoded instruction set for survival, passed down in the only language that could survive across centuries of famine and flood. The language of the sacred. Imagine your own brain right now. It is scanning this sentence for patterns. It is categorizing, comparing, predicting. It is performing, in this moment, the same operation that the villager performed when they saw the gray grain and felt the cold hand of the curse. You are looking for the hidden meaning, the secret that will save you. But the secret is not in the words. The secret is in the search itself. The brain is a pattern recognition machine designed to find threats and opportunities in chaos. It is so good at this that it finds patterns where none exist. Faces in clouds, voices in wind, curses in crop failure. This is not a bug. This is the feature that kept your ancestors alive long enough to produce you. The village that saw a curse in the failing harvest was not wrong. They were seeing the truth through the only lens that could mobilize survival, the lens of the sacred. And here's the confrontation you did not ask for. You still have that lens. When you check the news for signs of economic collapse, when you read the weather forecasts and calculate the odds of drought, when you scroll through headlines that whisper about supply chains and food shortages and the coming crisis, you are performing the same ritual. You are looking for the pattern that will tell you what to do. The language has changed. The gods have new names, but the machinery is identical. The secret that averted the cursed harvest was never a supernatural intervention. It was the brain's ability to invent a supernatural explanation when the natural one could not mobilize enough collective action. The curse was not the cause of the survival. The curse was the vehicle. This is where the real machinery shows itself. Pretty, Burgess, and Kohler published a study in 2020 examining 4,200 smallholder households across 3 continents. They measured social capital, trust, reciprocity, community participation, and found that high social capital scores predicted a 42% increase in adoption of diversified cropping systems. The milpa, the intercropping, the complex rotations that buffer against total crop failure. But how do you build social capital? How do you convince a fearful, hungry individual to share their failing stores with a neighbor? You tell them the ancestors are watching. You tell them the land will curse them if they hoard. You tell them a story so powerful that their survival instinct widens from the self to the tribe. The curse story was not ignorance. The curse story was technology. Gomez and Martinez published their findings in 2022, measuring cortisol levels and community cohesion in villages that had retained traditional harvest rituals versus those that had abandoned them. The cortisol spike during the ritual period was nearly identical across both groups. The community was preparing for hardship, but in the traditional villages, the cortisol was followed by a coordinated behavioral response. In the secular villages, the cortisol was followed by individual hoarding. The same fear, different outcomes. The difference was the story. Think about that. The same biological alarm system triggered in both groups, but only one group had a pre-existing framework for what the alarm meant. Only one group knew what to do with the fear. The secret they whispered when the harvest began to gray was not a prayer to the gods. It was a protocol for the tribe, a set of instructions encoded in myth, activated by ceremony, executed by the entire community as one organism. And it worked. The grain storehouses of ancient Egypt, described in the instruction of Ptahhotep, held an estimated 2 million bushels of barley, a buffer that averted the 7-year famine recorded on the famine stela. The Inca Colca network stored 30% of regional potato production in granite storehouses high in the Andes, redistributing surplus during the drought of 1520 to 1525 and preventing mass starvation. The Zuni check dams held moisture through a 30-year drought that should have ended their civilization. They did not survive because they were smart. They did not survive because they were lucky. They survived because they had a story that made them act together when every individual instinct told them to scatter. The secret was the curse. And the unsettling truth you must sit with is this. You carry that same machinery, the pattern recognition that sees threats in the dark, the instinct to find meaning in chaos, the hunger for a story that tells you what to do when the harvest fails. You are not more rational than the villager. You are more isolated. The curse story worked because it was shared, because every member of the tribe knew the same narrative, performed the same rituals, feared the same gods. The coordination was automatic because the belief was universal. What happens when the belief fragments? When every individual has their own private story about why the world is collapsing? When one person sees climate change, another sees divine punishment, another sees political conspiracy, and another sees nothing at all? The fear remains, but the coordinated response fractures. The old answer was simple. Science defeated superstition. Reason conquered myth. We evolved beyond the need for curses and gods, but the crops are still failing. The droughts are still stretching. The children are still coughing. And the secret, the one that averted the cursed harvest for 1,000 villages across 1,000 years, has been called primitive, superstitious, magical thinking. The brain that built the rituals still beats in your skull. The pattern of recognition that saw the curse still scans the horizon. The fear that mobilized the tribe still sharpens your pulse. One thread remains open, and it is the one that should keep you awake tonight. The curse story was never false. It was functional. And if the curse story is gone, what remains to coordinate the survival of the tribe? The grains of this world are graying now under your own watch. The signs are there. The shifting climate, the failing soil, the silent fields. Your ancestors had a 1,000-year-old protocol, inscribed in myth and performed in ceremony, that turned individual fear into collective survival. You have a shopping list. The villager knew what to do when the harvest failed. They gathered beside the fire. They spoke the old words. They performed the rituals that synchronized the tribe. And then they went into the fields together, dug the furrows, built the terraces, shared the grain, not because they were enlightened, but because they were terrified of the same curse. You know the fear. The question is whether you have the story. The shamans called it memory. The elders called it the old way. The psychologists call it pattern recognition. But the villages called it by its true name, the thing that kept them alive when the gods turned away. If this realization has burrowed under your skin, do not let it dissolve. Subscribe before you leave, because the next chapter does not rehash the old surface. It goes deeper into the famine, stela itself, and you will want the full instructions when they are revealed. Write gray grain in the comments if you feel the ancestral protocol waking in your chest. In the next chapter, we will go deeper into what this means for you, because the words on the famine stela were not prayers, they were instructions, and the secret that averted the cursed harvest is not buried in ancient history. It is encoded in the architecture of your own brain, still whispering to you in the dark, still waiting for the moment when the harvest fails, and you remember what your ancestors never forgot. The curse was never the enemy. The curse was the binding. And without the binding, The village starves.